Can I have the mic on? Yes, wonderful. So I'm going to ask you all to sit because we're going to start. This is going to be a very, very intense evening. It's the Whitney now has an exhibition open that is an incomplete history of protest, and it's kind of funny. This is going to be such an incomplete, even panel on protest tonight. But as you know, these salons are never meant to be exhaustive, but rather they're meant to spark ideas in you. And pretty much like a protest, they're also an opportunity to come together. We never get anywhere. We don't really have solutions, but we're all together. We reason on ideas that are urgent for us at any time, and hopefully some new thoughts can be sparked just by coming here. So my name is Paola Antonelli, and I've been working at the museum. 3 days ago was my 24th anniversary. I know. So, and I never had a dull moment, and these salons make working here even more amazing. Why? Because it gives the opportunity to people like me and like you to harness the power and the authority of this museum for good, sometimes for bad, but for good, to discuss really important topics. And this is the 23rd of these salons, and in the past we've covered topics like silence, death, truth, the future, culture, and metrics. And today we're going to talk about protest. We're going to talk about protest with the help of amazing presentations that were put together by Erica Petrillo. I don't know if Erica is here, but Erica, great job as usual. And and it starts with this amazing montage of a famous picture of the March on Montgomery in 1965, and instead the painting by Perlizza da Volpedo about the Fourth State, which is the Workers' March in Italy at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's quite a provocative montage, but it addresses the question, one of the questions for tonight. Is there a DNA to protest? I also have a problem pronouncing protest the right way, so I'll go protest many times. I apologize. Protest. Is there something in common amongst all protests? Is there something that can get close to a definition of protest, or is that just labeling politics? The whole idea of the salon was sparked by this article by Nathan Heller that was a review of several books that talked about the point of, is there any point to protesting today? And in particular, the article, which I recommend reading if you haven't already, was in the reading list, spoke about this one book, Inventing the Future by Nick Szymczyk. And provocatively, Szymczyk, together with his co-writer, spoke about protest being folk politics, talked about the impromptu and the prompt to come together as nostalgia for a past of more effective protests. And really, I was so grated by that particular article and so touched by it that I started thinking, really, is there a point to protesting? And we've seen many different protests lately. What have they done for us? And that's what Nathan Heller also talked about. He spoke about the protests against the war in Iran. He spoke about Black Lives Matter. He spoke about also the Women's March, and made me think, really, what have we achieved? And is there a metrics for success for protests? Interestingly, the graphs that were in the book, the book is not by right-wing intellectuals. No, it's by super left-wing Marxists, so it's even more grating to get this criticism from them. But so it talks about the certain kind of relationship of cost-benefit in protests, as if there could be a science to the finding of metrics of success. So it was an interesting and also provocative book, and an interesting and provocative article that made me think we could really achieve something by thinking of the role of protesting and the importance of protesting today. One thing that we don't think about much is what happens after protests. And this beautiful video by Cristina Lucas, La Liberté Raisonnée, which is based on the Delacroix 1830 painting that talked about the French Revolution, was really also quite momentous when I saw it the first time. As you can see, it's a reenactment of Delacroix, and Marianne, which resembles the freedom in the French Revolution, is seen in the moment of the Delacroix painting, but then we also see in the video the aftermath. In slow motion, Marianne tries to escape while the same folks, the same people that hailed her as a goddess, trample upon her and then kill her. And the whole goal for the revolution is then denied by human nature, which is not necessarily always towards good, always bent towards the good. So it's really interesting. There's an aftermath to revolution, and it's not always what we think it is. Is there also a possibility of a definition? Well, the role of Prometheus in mythology has given us a lot of fodder for metaphors for protest. So you see there a famous picture from the Second Intifada, and the definition of what Promethean behavior is. It's disobeying and trying to really push against authority. And it's about thinking of that the dynamics of disobedience is the spark of all knowledge. So once again, there's a certain aestheticization or poetry of protest behind it. Interestingly, there's also a lot of problems with names, and you know that happens all the time. So you see on the left-hand side a beautiful New York City atlas by Rebecca Solnit and Joshua Jelly Shapiro from 2016 that tries to trace the presence of riots in New York City over the centuries. Now, sometimes riots are defined quite clearly. I happened to be living in Los Angeles in 1992, so I was there for those riots. Other times, insurgency that are more violent than usual are also considered riots. So even in that case, the definition of a type of protest is already a form of judgment that is political as it is also descriptive and sociological. On the right-hand side, you see a very interesting global sound project of protest that is now on Google Maps. You can find it there. And it kind of it groups together sounds of protest that are recorded by people that participated in these kind of gatherings that are then positioned on a map of the world and are divided by subject of protest. So there are protests for democracy, for instance, that you see there. And it's quite fascinating to also go and try to feel the, even without understanding necessarily the language, trying to understand what the gist of the protest is about. Well, if we go back to the classic history of protest, there are so many tonight that even if we tried in a taxonomy, it would be more than incomplete. It would be just the beginning of one. But here you see 4 exemplary pictures that show the power of the individuals and of the collective, that show the power of strategy and tactics, that show the power of also being able to capture a moment that then can tell 1,000 stories. So when it comes to Rosa Parks, as we might know, well, that picture was taken after the whole episode happened. And Rosa Parks was not the first person that was actually arrested for sitting in the wrong part of the bus. But the strategy was such that the whole movement waited for the right person to rally behind. And then the boycott was launched that was supposed to last 1 day and lasted a year almost or more. So it was really about strategy and waiting. While Tiananmen, even though it was one person standing in front of the tanks in that particular picture, was not as strategic and also led to a repression as opposed to reform. It's quite interesting because there is Sidney Tarrow, thank you, Sidney Tarrow that talks about protests leading either to reform or repression or revolution. And in this particular case, Tiananmen led to repression, while you could say that the Montgomery, Alabama slowly but surely led to reform. Muharram protests in Iran were the ones that unseated Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, and instead brought Ayatollah Khomeini to power. And in that case, it was really that people. And the ILGWU strike in Chinatown in Manhattan in 1982 lasted one day, but it was such a convincing, powerful strike of all the Chinese women that were working in the sweatshops that it led to changes in policy and in contract by the owner of the sweatshop. So different lengths, different slow or fast movement, and also different outcomes, as happens also with other types of protest. We see here 4 very different episodes. One famously, Jan Palach in 1969, protesting not against the invasion of Prague by the Russians, but rather trying to shake the people of Czechoslovakia from the kind of depression that they were falling into, the proneness to making compromise. Then, of course, the very famous episode of Muhammad Ali in Houston in 1967, coming out of the press conference and the, or maybe it was the tribunal where he declared that he was not going to go to war because he had nothing to do with the Viet Congs, then they had done nothing to him. In the background, you see an activist locked in trying to stop the construction of a new freeway in England, and very small and more recent episode of Israeli pilots refusing to repatriate refugees coming from, for instance, Sudan or other places that were particularly dangerous. So in this case, it's about boycotting. It's about refusing to hail to the kind of power or violence that is imposed by power. Many other episodes that you will remember, from Act Up to Rihanna Brown, who was the first at Georgia Tech. She was the first dancer that decided to also take the knee during the national anthem. Famously, Tommy Smith and John Carlos in Mexico City in 1968, gold and bronze medal in the 200 meters, that decided to keep their fist and black glove up during the whole national anthem, and were backed by their team, but then had to be expelled because there was almost like a blackmail situation happening at the Olympic Games. Crimea 2014, the complaint choirs. I don't know if you've ever heard about them, but it's so interesting. So there are various degrees here of publicity. Some are very public, some are more intimate and local. And of course, South Korea in 2017, and Iram Sharmila, that is a woman that did a hunger strike for 16 years in India, protesting against paramilitary forces that were allowed by the Indian government. And she was force-fed through a gastrointestinal nose, a nose tube for about 16 years. Well, there's also different ways to wage protest. And it's very interesting because Eric and I had this debate on what is protest and what are the means of protest. And in my opinion, peace or violence are already forms of protest and not just means. And we were discussing this particular kind of juxtaposition when we were talking about, of course, the Vietnam War protest and the same image almost of peace and at the same time conviction and stern resolution happening in Louisiana with Yeshua Evans in July 2016. And of course, we know about Woodstock and the bed-ins by Yoko and John. Violence, on the other hand. So there's a very famous interview with Angela Davis in prison in 1972 in which she talks so convincingly and openly about the fact that it's almost hypocritical to ask people that have experienced violence for a very long time to ask them whether using violence is allowed, permitted, or right. And it really made me think a lot. There's a, right now in the, where is it, at the New Museum? At the Whitney also, thank you. Daniel Joseph Martinez Divine Violence art installation that is about 120 plus names of organizations that have used violence to shake or to protest, or from Al-Qaeda to instead the Red Brigades. And the Red Brigades also led Erica and I to an interesting conversation. I grew up in Milan, and so did Erica, but there's many years between us. And to me, the Red Brigades are still very much about my childhood. So when you see Antonio Negri and Michael Hardt in our reading list, to me, Antonio Negri's Tony Negri, who was considered, whether it's true or not, to be behind the Red Brigades and therefore behind the attempted murder of my best friend's uncle, right? And so I still cringe. And instead, to Erica, he's a political philosopher that has written very important books and a theoretician that deserves to be quoted. So also time really changes the value of protest, and other images of violence, and also violence versus non-violence, Nehru and Gandhi, and Dr. King and Malcolm X, and great texts that I recommend you read. One is Hannah Arendt on violence, and then Philip Mumford's Introduction to Pacifism, that shows that the line is very clear when it comes to behavior, but blurred when it comes to implementation and deployment of the two. Media. And we know very well that at this point we can wage protest by using the media in the right way. And I'm saying it without any cynicism, just knowing what the weapons are today that can get us to really achieve effect. And you see here a dervish dancer in in Gezi Park in 2013. Actually, that is in the Taksim Square, but it was for the protests of Gezi Park. And then the human boat that is in MIA's video for the song Borders in 2016. So being able to reach as wide an audience as possible by choosing the right way to transmit that particular idea. And the various hashtags and symbols that we've seen lately. This beautiful program by Jana Traboulsi will be known to people here from the Arab world, especially from Lebanon. She has taken pictures that are very famous coming from the news and has superimposed slogans onto them and then released them to the people on the internet, on Instagram especially, and Twitter, and they have taken it on and spread them virally. White Wednesdays is for women in Saudi, especially in the Arab world, deciding not to wear their veils on Wednesdays. J20 art strike is an art strike of sorts. Delete Uber, it did have an effect, as we know very well. And Me Too, of course, which has been really very much on our minds and eyes, and that has reverberations that will be felt for decades to come. Black Lives Matter also, and many other campaigns have been powerfully spread by the ability to reach everybody through media. And right now we wanted to give a shout out to the students from Florida that are trying to make their voices heard and that already have succeeded in having several companies cut ties to NRA. I just found out that one of the biggest retailers that I didn't even know existed, called Dick, has stopped selling. It's the truth, has stopped selling automatic rifles and is not going to sell guns to people younger than 21. So that's a big achievement. What the government doesn't do, people will do because of their power. And that's really the point. Civic society has an effect. This map that is very seductive, and I don't know the accuracy and how it's measured, but it's truly seductive, tries to show the reverberations that we can have, that we can achieve just by really being convinced about what we want to do and also trying to reach people that are far away in all means at our disposal. It's a very fascinating map that we will study more in depth, maybe not tonight, but in the future. But tonight we will have 4 + 1 + many real great experts to discuss all of these different points. And we will start with Jamal Joseph, who is at this point a professor at Columbia University in the School of Cinema and is also a great poet and writer, and has directed movies, and also used to be a Black Panther and was part of the 21 Panther group that was incarcerated in the late 60s here in New York. Then we will have Kaydrianne Young. Is it Kaydrianne next? Yeah, thank you. Erica knows everything. I don't know a thing. So Kaydrianne Young is a justice advocate born and raised in Florida, and she is also the operations coordinator at Million Hoodies. So she has been really involved in the grassroots efforts in these past few years. Then we will have Steve Schapiro. Steve is a wonderful documentary photographer and has taken pictures. For instance, we chose that particular picture of Montgomery because it worked really well with the montage with Pelizza da Volpedo, but he was there too, and he's taken other pictures throughout the civil rights movement and documented the civil rights movement. Last but not least, Biella. Biella is a veteran of the Museum of Modern Art and our experiments in public programs, and she is a scholar, and also she's a great scholar and also the foremost authority on Anonymous. She has written a book about Anonymous and knows everything there is to know about hackers and the kind of protest and the kind of upheaval that can happen using the internet and using the digital world and digital means of communication. But tonight we will also have, and this is an experiment for the salons, we will have a series of 1-minute videos. We have asked people all over the world questions, and we've asked them to answer these questions. And moreover, we have also asked a wonderful artist, Tania Bruguera, who has an installation here at MoMA that you might not want to miss because it's so powerful, to tell us about her experience and whether an artist can create a political space. So Tania's installation is called Havana, Untitled Havana. It's from 2000. It is installed here in the museum on the second floor. It will be, it's part of the MoMA collection, but the installation is quite momentous. So we're going to have it up until March 15th, right? 11th, thank you, until March 11th. It's truly worth experiencing. And so, Tania, our guest of honor, would you mind please answering this question for us, which is, do I have the slide of her? I can't remember anymore. Oh yeah, I do have the slide. I can't remember anymore if I had it. So this is a slide of her installation. It's much darker than that. But if you don't mind standing up. Yeah, you can stand up and just face people. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on the experimental side of this series. I think one of the questions I ask myself as an artist who is interested in understanding or researching if art can be part of social change and political change is when is art needed? Many times part of the practice of art is to rehearse. We rehearse constantly. And this is also something activists do. They rehearse constantly until the right time arrives, and hopefully we are prepared. We never prepare, but we jump in the occasion with some kind of toolboxes that we can use. But another aspect of this question, can we create a political situation through art, is also a matter of form. And some people will be surprised that I talk about form. But it is because as an artistic practice that I have developed, and many friends of ours, is how can you create a form that is not recognized by those you are opposing? How can you create a form that makes those in power pause because they need to figure it out what it is before they are able to censor it? So I feel that as an artist, that time that those people we protest against, those people we are trying to challenge, figure out what's going on, is the time by the work has an operational momentum, has the possibility to create change, not only by inviting more people into the conversation, but by actually pushing the boundaries of that conversation a little bit young. Another thing is how can you, through your practice, whether an art or activist, understand what are the areas of ignorance of the people you're protesting against? Why? Because I give you an example. In the year 2015, I had proposed a project in Cuba that the government didn't like, and so they took my passport, put me in prison, etc. But in the interrogation sessions, the interrogator was telling me, who is Tatlin? Because the piece was called Tatlin Whisper, referring to the Russian artist. And then she went to Wikipedia, and learned by her who Tatlin was in the next interrogation session. She was, I don't understand. He was a socialist. He was like a, you know, a revolutionary. I said, me too. And then I realized in the process that because she had to go and learn something because of my work, I had then a space to push and to protest, not publicly, but privately, intimately. And then what I did next is to propose the reading of Hannah Arendt, Origins of Totalitarianism. So with the hope that they will come and at least read at least like one paragraph. That'll be enough for me. So I feel that in a way, part of what happens with art protest is how can we go through an emotional education in order to understand the role of the feeling of feeling uncomfortable. How can we understand what to do with our fears, what to do, not only with hate, not only with anger, not only with pain, but also with fear, and also with the idea of understanding progress. Progress not as the happy ending, but as a very painful situation by which you have to go through things you don't know. So I feel also in a way that one of the things I'm advocating in my work is the concept of political timing and specificity. And by that I mean work that is not representing the political, but creating the political. And for that you need to understand the language of the people you are protesting. You need to kind of put yourself away from your own body and look from afar. And in this sense, for me, art is a very wonderful tool. I think it's the best tool for protest, basically. So, thanks.
Thank you. So now we can start with the first series of videos.
If the status quo is one that relies on the strategic suppression of certain truths, we would have the power to overturn the status quo if we, like the hurricanes, would commit to blowing the lid off of all these suppressed stories, all these suppressed truths, all these suppressed imaginations and realities and powers of all these beautiful people. If we made like hurricanes and committed to reveal all of our truths, then we can arm people with the self-actualization, with the self-love, with the self-determination that can only be achieved with self-knowledge. Lacking that in society is precisely what allows these status quos to persist, status quos that work to the benefit of some and to the detriment of most.
Yay. Too much room between one and the other. Okay. Can you tell them that for the rest?
The question, the context, and the format of the salon made me think about Guy Debord's 1952 film, Owls for Sade. In the film, 5 voices read the script. The screen is white when they read and black during silent intervals, with the final sequence of silence and black screen lasting 24 minutes. I chose to offer to the salon the following quotations from Debord's script. I know people only by their actions. In other respects, they are indistinguishable from each other. In the final analysis, we are differentiated only by our works. Like lost children, we live our unfinished adventures. Order reigns, but does not govern. A science of situations needs to be created, which will incorporate elements from psychology, statistics, urbanism, and ethics. These elements must be focused on a totally new goal, the conscious creation of situations. The arts of the future can be nothing less than disruption of situations. Just as the projection was about to begin, Guy Debord was supposed to step onto the stage and make a few introductory remarks. Had he done so, he would simply have said, "There is no film. Cinema is dead. No more films are possible. If you wish, we can now move to a discussion."
Do I think artists can change the status quo? Of course, I know they can. They can incite us to protest by demanding for it in their work. They can call out injustices, as writers for Guernica magazine do all of the time, so that we aren't blind to them. They can envision different, better worlds, alternatives, and show us what might be possible, even when those worlds are fictional, especially when those worlds are fictional. They can lead us to question ourselves and our own assumptions, and inhabit diverse points of view. They can bring us closer together. But it's easy to put the onus on artists, to expect artists to produce something in particular or possess certain politics. We don't talk enough about the role and responsibility of the cultural consumer. There's so much art being produced. Find something that resonates with you, that excites you, that gives you hope, that surprises you, that shatters your worldview, and support it. Buy it, read it, watch it, promote it. The more books we consume, written by people of color, by LGBTQ authors, the more books we'll see written by people of color and LGBTQ authors. If we're tired of wandering museums filled with paintings by dead white European men, we should find art spaces that are showing different art and champion them. Especially now, the cultural consumer helps decide what gets published, what gets widely shown, what gets heard, what gets funded, what gets assigned value. They're infinite artists with infinite perspectives, creating work that has the power to shut this shitty system down. If we want the status quo to change, we have to find it and sing it out.
Woo-hoo. All right, Jamal, you're on. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Jamal Joseph. Oh, you want the clicker? It's there.
No, am I good from here?
Yeah.
And I turn it. Hi, good evening, everyone. How are you? All power to the people. Thank you, Paula and Erica and everyone for this evening. In the introduction, Paula said, former Black Panther. I think a lot of us have been called back to active duty. Right on. And all the Panthers who are now in their 60s and 70s, and Bobby Seale just turned 80. I want to speak from that perspective and from the perspective of the griot, the artist educator. I was asked to speak about education and protests. The griot was a person who would sit in the middle of the village underneath the baobab tree in Africa, and they were the storyteller, the drummer, the dancer, the actor, the poet, the poetess. And the griot had a duty to do two things in order to be a good griot. They needed to be entertaining, so they needed to be a good artist, but they also had the responsibility of communicating the history, really importantly, the present, but also vision the future of the tribe. Now, if you did one and not the other, you weren't a great griot. If you were a griot that, who was, had all of the facts and all of the history, the young people would kind of say, hey, you know what? I'm going to walk 10 miles to the next village, to the other griot, because I had my nap already. That griot was boring. By the same token, if you were a griot that was really entertaining, had great beats on the drum, great stories, great stuff that you did, but your facts weren't right, people in the back would be like, I don't know. You know, I was at that hunt, and the griot's talking about, say, who killed that lion? But it was really his little sister, Keisha. Those two things, in terms of being the artist educator, created something that we call the artivist. And in the Black liberation struggle, here, it was hand in hand with the Black arts movement, where we had people like Sonia Sanchez and Amiri Baraka and the Last Poets and the New Lafayette Theater that was doing art that was meant to move people to action and awareness. In this sense, when we talk about protests and what it represented to movements here, those protests and those gatherings were similar to those afternoons in the African village. Protests in that sense, in terms of the vibrancy and what it did, was to the movement what concerts are to music. They bring people together in a common place so that they can share something and energize them about that. Hopefully build relationships, something that continues after that particular concert came to an end. So those protests were not meant to be a one-off, but rather a gathering of people that did a couple of things. Talking about the education component, something that was taught to me as a young Panther. I joined the Panthers at 15 years old by someone who was an amazing artist, activist, and teacher, Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mom, and my big sister in the Black Panther Party. And we'd go to political education class, and of course we'd study Fanon and Malcolm X and Che Guevara, and we learned the 10-point program. But the idea that was communicated that our real goal in the Black Panther Party, not just the 10-point program, not the idea of all power to the people, which meant black power to black people, but white power to white people, brown power to brown people, red power to red people, yellow power to yellow people, and we would say X power to the unknown. The idea that all people would come together in this class struggle for human rights, not just civil rights, but that the goal of the movement was not to have everyone become Panthers, but to make itself obsolete by educating the people, by leading by example. And so artists have this ability to do something magical and wonderful. They have the ability to educate and stimulate through their art. Not educate in the sense of always being didactic and laying out the answers, but the possibility of some of those questions. The ability to get people to see the possibility of struggle, the possibility of a world that's different, the possibility of transformation, and by the very fact that they have gathered, the possibility that they can be that change that they are seeking. And so the best art kind of does that in terms of the movement sense and what it's done throughout history. So when we talk about arts and education, it's not just in the classroom, and it's not just the fact that many great protests, in fact, around the world, we have seen students take the lead. College protests in the 60s, it would be San Francisco State, it would be Columbia University where I teach, it would be Ohio State, but then it would be students in Paris and in London and all throughout the world that would join in that. And now we are seeing it from the high school students in Florida in terms of accomplishing something and moving a conversation more in 2 weeks than it has in the last 8 years. So that art can excite and can inform and can do certain things, can do those things. One of the things that the examples is the South African play Sarafina. Sarafina was created by students and young people in a house in South Africa under the direction of Bogani and Gamer that led people together and tell their stories. And then they set those stories to music and dance. But remember, the story in Sarafina was about the Sharptown massacre that happened in South Africa of students who were protesting. And so they took that very human tragedy and created a piece that came to New York, New Heritage Theater that Vosa Rivers runs, and then I'm artistic director, helped bring it to New York, to Lincoln Center, to Broadway. But people would come out of that and be tasked to do something, to write letters, to protest, to come out for demonstrations, to participate in the worldwide economic boycott of apartheid that became the external pressure that helped the grassroots folks in South Africa from the ANC, people that were fighting on the political front, people that were resisting with arms, to bring an end to the apartheid movement. It is what the power of arts and activism can be. It is what Paul Robeson meant when he said that artists are the gatekeepers of the truth. I want to give a film example of something that is a powerful piece of art that helped bring back, that helped bring awareness and help create something very dynamic. If you can roll this short clip, and this is a Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton, who was a great organizer in Chicago, not just in terms of what he was doing in the black community, but he created something called the Rainbow Coalition that brought young lords together, people from the Patriots Party who were working class, grassroots, hillbilly white folks, workers, all together in the original grassroots coalition. Watch this short clip.
When they got together, you'd be doing Bobby Seale, yes, they got together with guns, and there's nothing wrong with that, because we need some guns. Black people need some peace. White people need some peace. And we are going to have to fight. We're going to have to struggle. We're going to have to struggle relentlessly to bring about some peace, because the people that we're asking for peace, they're a bunch of megalomaniac warmongers, and they don't even understand what peace means. And we've got to fight them. We've got to struggle with them to make them understand what peace means. Bobby Seale is going through all types of physical and mental torture. But that's all right, because we said even before this happened, and we're going to say it after this, and after I'm locked up, and after everybody's locked up, that you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution. Nothing's more important than stopping fascism, because fascism will stop us all. Say that, that I am a revolutionary.
What we're watching now is scenes that were taken by young white filmmakers after the murder of Fred Hampton. On December 4th, 1969, the Chicago police raided the apartment where Fred Hampton lived and killed him while he was sleeping next to his pregnant wife, and 4 other Panthers were seriously wounded. The story of the police was that there was a shootout. The filmmakers came and began to document, and one of the things that they saw with this film is that all of the bullet holes from this fierce shootout that was happening between the Panthers and the police, that all of the bullet holes were going from outside the apartment inside the apartment. The other thing that the Panthers did was that they opened the apartment up. The Chicago police did not seal the apartment. Inspired by what had happened by the murder of Emmett Till 13 years earlier, where Mamie Till left the coffin open so people could see what happened to her son when he was on a family vacation in Mississippi. And 50,000 Chicagoans came out to see it. The Panthers left this apartment open, and thousands of Chicagoans, black, white, brown, yellow, red, came to see what had happened. The filmmakers had started out just following a dynamic young leader, Fred Hampton. They didn't know that they would be documenting an assassination. But it was this film footage, and it was the work of the people in the community that created, and that rainbow coalition that Fred had built, that brought about justice eventually, that got State's Attorney Hanrahan on the end of the civil suit that eventually had to do with an apology from the city of Chicago, and the realization of what had happened. It was art that became truth, that became outrage, that became a movement that brought about a change. We still speak Fred Hampton's name today, but that capturing of what happened on film and people being moved to action, to protest, and to fight this unrelenting struggle, it took several years to get justice, is an example of art being transformational and what we can do using it as artivism. When you combine activism and art, you have the artivism, and you have that little flame, and that art, as Paul Robeson said, that makes the artist the gatekeeper of truth.
Yay! Thank you. Thank you. Now let's roll the next video, please.
So it's been famously said that evil triumphs only when good women and men are silent. We know throughout history that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's well understood. But the only check and balance, the only source of holding leaders, whether in government or corporations, to account is through people power, holding them to account. And I think that in recent times, we've seen the clear metrics of success of people power and protest. In this country, the Me Too campaign, the children who've come out against gun violence are very clear evidence of clear success metrics which are visible. But if you take a country like Poland, not so long ago, when the government was attacking the independence of judiciary, you saw massive protests of people standing up to protect the independence of the judiciary, and examples abound throughout history. So I think eternal vigilance is the prize of liberty, and that vigilance is exercised through the right to peaceful protest, and I think we should always cherish it. It's also said that, the change can only come about when people stand up, and I think we have to respect this and celebrate it.
By the way, this was the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Salil Shetty, just coming out of Tanya's installation yesterday. And so that's why the recording is not perfect, but Erica did a great job getting him to see the show and talking about. And we will put everything online afterwards, so you will be able to listen to it better afterwards. Kaydrianne, do you want to come to the stage, please?
Hello. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
There we go. My name is Kaydrianne Young. I am the daughter of immigrants Patrick and Sharon Young, who have, since they stepped foot on this country, have not ceased to pour love, power, and truth into everything that they do. And this evening, I'm going to be sharing with y'all my personal journey to empowerment so that we can look at that as an exploration of youth and their power in protest. So, as you know, I grew up in Miami, Florida, and Bloomberg rates Miami, Florida as one of the top 10 unequal cities in the US. It was very common for me in a 15-minute drive to pass by Starbucks, Whole Foods, elaborate parks, and be amongst the top magnet schools in the country. But by the end of my 15-minute journey, be outside of streets that had no sidewalks for children to play, trash littering the floor, no sign of a healthy food store for miles, and yet fast food stores, liquor stores, and check cashing stores would line the perimeter. And so I've always grown up with an innate understanding of the discrepancies between the distribution of resources, but for too long I willfully, admittedly, wanted to be somewhat naive about the true and insidious reason for this discrepancy. And so growing up in a Southern Baptist Christian home, things were very strict, right? The common refrain was children are seen and not heard. So from a very early age, and as was continued to be ironed into me, I learned that I needed to respect power that was very authoritarian, right? That was very hierarchical. But little by little, there are certain things that started to chip away at that foundation, and that allowed me to break past some personal confines and confines that I had been socialized to respect, and to really be an agent of change to bring about the future that I want to see in the world. So that really started as soon as I can get away from my parents. I went to college in North Florida, and through my studies of environmental justice and sociology, I learned about the communities of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where you have historically Black and brown communities that are literally enshrouded in petrochemical infrastructure that taints the water that folks drink and the air that people breathe. And with the economic constriction caused by redlining, which was further cemented by these petrochemical facilities being mere feet away, the government not mandated to tell folks what was right outside of their homes, it just became extremely clear to me the systemic oppression and the way that the matrices of oppression around gender, race, and class come together to form situations that, unless we have bright beacons of light that show the way to the truth, are very, very difficult to break past. And so it was with the oral Proctor history program at the University of Florida that I went on a tour through the Bible Belt and learned directly from civil rights icons what it means to struggle for freedom. And you can see, you know, part of protest for me is really learning my history, right? Nowadays, there are textbooks that say that Africans came to this continent as indentured servants, willfully, right? There are history books today that say that the indigenous people of this continent willfully migrated west, right? And so it is by going throughout the Bible Belt and being continually steeped and reaffirmed in the history of the Black freedom struggle and learning directly from women like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was born as a sharecropper and dared to believe that she had the dignity and was deserving of the respect for her vote to be counted by the United States. So despite risking death, she journeyed to the polls, risked death to cast her vote. And here you see me and the delegation of students at the Civil Rights History Museum in Belzoni, Mississippi. And before we left the South, we stopped and visited Miss Laura Dixie, an icon in Tallahassee who passed recently, unfortunately. And it was through her that we learned how difficult it really is to carry out things like bus boycotts and how you have to have tough but firm love to keep your folks in line and let those who hold the power really feel the economic power of those that they're oppressing. I also had the fortune of meeting Miss Margaret Block, a true political force who also passed in 2015. And she taught me that a lot of what protesting about is music. From the first moment that we met her, she was teaching us freedom songs and telling us the way that they sustain folks through times where homes were bombed, right? You couldn't even go to church and not worry about your safety. But everywhere we went, she had a song for us and a pep in her step and just continued to break down the traditional notions of what protest is supposed to be. And growing up in I grew up in the suburbs, right? I was always in gifted AP classes, meaning that I was one of 2 Black boys or 2 Black girls in a class. So I was, from the very beginning, told that a lot of what I had to do was to confine to standards that were different from my own, different from my family. So a part of what I now see as protest is really just loving myself, right? And appreciating the differences between the African American and the white canon and not always having to ascribe to the ideals of others. And I also learned that sometimes protesting is really just about not being afraid, right? Having the courage to be the youngest person in the room and not have fear of speaking your mind, not worrying about the ethos that folks bestow upon people who are older than us, and just being unafraid of speaking truth to power. And some folks might wonder why we really have to protest these days, right? What is it really for? What is it about? And it's because, as we've seen, folks continue to die at the hands of gun violence. People continue to build pipelines that threaten the water sources of indigenous folks who don't have other means to sustain their communities. And yet the refrain we hear time and time over is my condolences, how sad, what folks wish that they could do to help that situation. Where usually the folks who have the biggest mic are the folks who have the power to litigate and bring forth those legislative solutions that would not necessitate these thoughts and prayers. So, shy little girl became someone who was gathering her peers and taking them to the United Nations to advocate for women's empowerment, gender equity, right? This shy little girl was looking at her black president and telling him to do better, telling him to stop being the deporter-in-chief, telling him to stop allowing the permitting processes of things like the KXL pipeline, right? This little girl was sitting here uplifting narratives that, although they don't always lead to definitive legislative solutions, surely define the narrative from which folks in power have to show that they're pressurable, have to show that they value human dignity, have to show that they respect the lives of folks who don't live and look like them. And I also manage state house campaigns across Florida and help to elect Democratic champions who will never bring true liberation to the people, but will continue to provide pathways for folks to speak truth to power. And so we continue to fight for 15 and a union. We continue to advocate that the Gulf South not be a sacrifice zone in the fight to bring renewable energy onto the grid. I continue to stand up with my Indigenous brothers and sisters, and it's notable that the Standing Rock protest camp was started by the Indigenous Youth Council, whose elders tried to get them to stop this protest that grew into an international spectacle, right? And so I ask y'all, with not too much time left, just to remember that youth continue to light the way and to always invite us to have a seat at the table and to accept our voices. Yay.
Next video's up. Thank you, Kaydrianne.
Newsome, president of Black Lives Matter, New York. Effective protest gets results. Protests that are consistent. Protests that keep the pressure on the system. By educating the community, by answering their questions, by giving them the knowledge. Movements need a leader because organizations need structure. We're going up against an oppressive system that's been around for hundreds of years, for centuries. Develop leaders by informing people of how to fight for themselves. By example, you develop leaders by training people. They can rally a team and organize an action on their own.
Trumpy Donald wanted a wall. Trumpy Donald had a great fall. All of his Russian investors and friends couldn't put Donald together again. How do you write a protest song? Every moment in history has a soundtrack. The popular songs that define the period, the rhythm that reflects the dynamics of its moment. Every moment has also a political soundtrack, comprised of the voices that express dissent and offer a critique of their governments, the events, attitudes, and policies that ail their society. In 2011, we formed El Club de Protesta, a project to help individuals in lower-income housing in New York to express their concerns and their fears through song. None of them had a musical background. To write a protest song, you don't need to be an accomplished writer or composer. You need to have a cause, to be motivated, and channel your frustration and put it into rhythm and a musical form. A song can be born from the desire to comment on a historical event or present, or from the need to address other issues. We often employ folk songs, popular songs that everyone knows, changing its lyrics to lyrics that speak to the political moment. Try it today. Take a popular folk song and make it yours. Make it of our moment.
Okay. And now I give to you Steve Schapiro.
I need a flipper.
Oh, you want it there? All right.
Hi. I think songs are great. I mean, I think that really is a thing that really inspires people. I've seen a lot of protests, and one of the things that most influences me, or that I really enjoy, is some of the signs that have come out of protests, such as the I Am a Man sign, which came out of the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis. And then I saw this woman in New Jersey in front of a Grand Union store, and she was protesting the fact that prices were going up too high. But basically, the Grand Union store isn't there anymore, and the sanitation workers aren't really striking anymore. But at the same time, these are two signs which very much influence me and which I enjoy. On Bobby Kennedy's campaign, the car that followed him, the second car, was usually the magazine photographers and also the newspaper reporters. But gradually, television came into the scene, and television became a much better way of communicating to people. And so television then became in the second car, and everyone else moved back. But what was interesting about all of this is that people started to take their own personal thoughts and put them on signs themselves. And then they would go to these rallies or events, and they would hold up their sign with the hope that the television camera would photograph them and that they could be on 6 o'clock news, and also that what they felt in their hearts could also be there. And that, you know, missed a picture.
It's the big green one.
The green one?
Yeah.
There we go. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's an example of that. The Vietnam War came, and, you know, I don't think you have to go into all the protest about that. We don't have the time either. But we all know that really protest really changed that and really pretty much ended the war, amongst other things, including a lot of people getting killed in all different ways. The March on Washington was a gala and celebration. And Dr. King did his I Have a Dream speech. And there's a picture here of Jackie Robinson with his family and Rosa Parks leading a parade. And there are these big signs which the unions financed, which talk about all the things that should happen: wages, integration, all the things that really were important in terms of civil rights. And everyone had a really great time. But Jerome Smith, who was one of the original freedom riders, felt that really the protesters should have lied down on the train tracks in Washington to prevent people from going home with this happy feeling, and then let them realize that the revolt, that the march, that the civil rights movement had really just begun, and there was so much more to do. I don't have the pictures for this, but when in Birmingham, the police came out with their high-pressure water hoses and pushed people aside and let their dogs go at people and bite them and tear their clothes. Charles Moore was a photographer who took pictures of this. And then Life magazine photographed it in a big way. And suddenly, people all throughout the country who had had not much concept of what was really happening in the South saw all of this. And it's one of the few times when really, maybe not one of the few times, maybe there are many of them, but this was certainly a time when photojournalism affected the attitudes of an entire country. The Birmingham situation is very interesting because the protest itself was a very quiet protest and had not expected all of this. But the reaction of a segregated or a segregationist population of these police and troopers, really, the negative aspects of it turned the protest into a positive thing in terms of civil rights. So you see, sometimes the bad things really have more effect in terms of protest than the good things. A protest is about publicity. Protest is about getting your words out, getting people to understand you, getting people to agree with you. And I think that's one particular area or one particular place where all of that happened. I covered the Selma March. I'm not going to go into the beginnings of the Selma March. A few things really interested me about it. One was this girl laughing at this line of troopers. I was in Durham, North Carolina one time, and this girl came up to me. We were talking, and she said, that man, talking to a sheriff, that man caused me to spend 30 days in jail. But it wasn't said with hate or animosity. It was said with a sense of pride, in a way. The Selma March, and then there's another picture here which has relevance for today, which is Stop Police Killings. And this is 1965, and it's a middle-aged woman. The Selma March, the third Selma March, started with 3,000 people who were allowed to go only so far until they came to a two-road highway, or a two-lane highway, at which point only 300 people were allowed to march in that march. I particularly like this picture. This is a boy who put white on his face and wrote vote, and it seemed to me to sum up really what was the event and what was this all about. Marchers. 300 people really changed the voting registration law, because it was those 300 people who affected Lyndon Johnson finally to make the move. The Occupy New York, the Occupy Wall Street protest has always been a curiosity to me, in the sense that I know what the real aims of it were, in the sense that I know what the Selma March was about, I know what various marches were about, I know what the sanitation were, but really, I think this was a great celebration for everyone. One of the things I saw was this sign, which is, it basically said, they've been on a hunger strike for the 15 days now. And there were these two kids, and one of them has hunger strike on her head, and the other one has 99%. And basically, what are they hunger striking about? I mean, what really was the aim there? What was the specifics about it? This is just a picture I took at a rally in Chicago of a white student with a mask. And this was a picture I took really a year ago at the Women's March. And it's this woman with all her signs, which really matter today. Father Pfleger in Chicago, when 250 people, when 750 people in the course of a year were shot, mostly in the South Side, but in other parts of Chicago, he organized a march through Chicago down the main drag of Michigan Avenue, and everyone carried what would you call it?
A cross?
Yeah.
Like for
along with a portrait of the person. This became a very poignant picture for me, in the sense of these people who lost someone who was very dear to them. But it was, again, a protest that was very effective in its way. I don't know that it stopped the shooting, which is one of the rallies that Father Pfleger has every Friday night. And this, I was in New York. I was about to catch a plane, and I went to the Women's March, and these were some of the things I saw. The Me Too, the Resist Trump at the Trump Plaza Hotel in Chicago. These others are from that march. And this, to me, is a picture I took in 2013, but certainly it has resonance today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Two more videos.
I'm James Victore. I believe any act of creativity is a form of protest, a threat and a challenge to the status quo. Today, what is historically the American ideal. The ability to voice an opinion is seen as un-American or even treasonous. My own experience of protest through ink on paper multiplied 1,000-fold is of lighting a spark and igniting a grass fire, giving others the permission to let their voices be heard. If the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, our vigilance is by the truth and our humor and our art and design and poetry. Our creativity is as important as honest journalism in the face of these Philistine inbred monarch wannabes. Be creative, resist, persist, take a knee, speak up, buy a billboard, post a meme, vote, donate, protest. Fuck Trump.
We still protest. In my opinion, because we need to believe there is a we. In societies that are more and more centered around the individual, building a sense of community and solidarity is essential if we want to demand social change. It also forces us to leave comfortable positions, to put our bodies on the street, to march and chant with others, sometimes be associated with people we don't identify with, sometimes be humiliated, be victims of violence. And specifically today, where technology gives us the illusion that we're part of big public debates, where effectively most often we talk to people who believe, who think like us, we chose the communities we're addressing, we stay comfortably behind our desks. There are a set of privileges and comfort we need to give up if we believe and demand equality. Last, to answer the question of creativity as a form of resistance, I would say it is in so many forms, but mainly because it allows us to imagine different worlds and it expands our political imaginary. By doing this, it gives us hope to be able to then take action.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
And Gabriella Coleman.
All right, I'm gonna be a little bit different and talk from here because I find if I don't have a script, now that I lecture to students all the time, I can talk and talk and talk, and I don't want to do that. So I read that New Yorker article as well, and I was really grated by it. And I really want to concentrate on the prompt, is there any point to protest? And I'm going to answer today as both an anthropologist and as someone who works on digital media. So the very short answer, and very much inspired by everything that just came before, is absolutely yes. But of course, there's some caveats. So protests under the best of circumstances can lead to change that you could actually track. But I actually think that is unfortunately the exception, and it's not the rule. Still, I think protest often creates the conditions for perseverance through ritual effervescence, pleasure, and bonding, which is something people have talked about. And so it sustains the desire to continue engaging in really what is the long, very, very difficult haul of political life. I think the less we apply a neoliberal logic to protest, the logic being if you can't measure it or if it doesn't have immediate effects, it's not worthwhile, the less likely we will feel dejected when protest fails to spark immediate change. And I'm really making this point because I actually see this logic at play with some of my students who I'll lecture about Anonymous, my area of specialty, and they'll be like, yeah, but what change has happened? And I was like, okay, I need to kind of reframe the whole question if they're applying that kind of neoliberal logic. So I think the less we do away with that logic, the more that we can convince people to protest again or to go beyond protest. We have to signal that protest is necessary, it's vital, but it's also insufficient. So to defend protest also entails recalibrating our expectations around this activity. And so we have to puncture some myths that come with protests. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the myths that come with digital media and politics. And you'll see that was hard for me to say for a reason. Let me see, how does one use this big button? I really dislike the term internet activism or digital activism. I've railed against it many, many times because I don't think that it really exists. I think there's different types of actors and social movements who wield different digital genres like the hashtag, to use one example, different types of tools and tactics like hacking, and they do so differently to yield almost incomparable forms of protest. Some interventions like computer hacking are quite historically novel, and many, many forms where you're really hacking into a company, maybe deleting everything, taking emails, posting online. Well, that is almost incomparable to something like the online protest, though I do kind of like this online petition. And I think if we flatten and paper over these differences, it makes it harder both to assess the use of some of these different tools and appreciate how we might strategically wield different genres of communication and tactics of protest online. So now I'm going to address myth number 2. Once upon a time that has thankfully, I think, ended quite abruptly in 2016, boosters tended to claim that social media like Twitter today and blogs in the past facilitated more participatory democratic forms of protest. Naturally, such a very, very naive take led to pushback where people would say, no, this thing called digital activism, which I don't think exists, is really slacktivism. And Malcolm Gladwell is kind of famous for writing a New Yorker article about this. So, you know, probably everyone here doesn't believe in either of these two positions, and for the last decade, there have been all sorts of people who've lambasted both. But I think a lot of people actually wouldn't listen, and again, I would frequently hear people who would kind of embrace one or either position. But I think actually now people are starting to not believe in either position, in part because of the far right and our president-in-chief, who have been so adept at commanding these same tools for protest and recruiting members of the public. This is a really interesting slide. This is Alice Marwick from Data and Society, which is really a research shop which is deep doing research on the far right. And they are really incredibly smart about using digital tools for protest and for recruiting. I also think, you know, as much as you might hate Trump, he is kind of a genius at some level on Twitter, where people are completely attracted to kind of watch him sort of like a 20-car pileup on the road, right? And he himself has recognized, I love Twitter. It's like owning your own newspaper without the losses. So the right successes, Trump, the far right, have provided a welcome and dual reality check. It's much harder to uncritically puff up the power of these tools as being good in themselves, but failing to use them would be just plain foolish and a lost opportunity today. So the less we portray these tools as possessing intrinsically redeeming value, the more people can concentrate what matters for protests, which is strategy. The pertinent question is not whether protests matter, but in the case of digital media, how do we apply these tools strategically? And of course, since there's different genres of tactics and communication, I can't offer any universal advice, but let me highlight one well-known condition constraining online communication. If protest demands of its public's gobs of attention, attention is awful hard to come by online. Many make this point today, but already in 1997, technology writer Michael Goldhaber was prescient enough to note the economy of attention, not information, is the natural economy of cyberspace. So strategy could entail a mix of charismatic rhetoric, luring in the mainstream media for a signal boost, unexpected and audacious interventions, and capitalizing off notable or tragic events, as well as many, many other strategic interventions. So, to finish, even if we must take strategy seriously, I still think we should always avoid the neoliberal trap of demanding immediate results from such interventions. Since 2003, when the largest protest in the world failed to stop the war in Iraq, naysayers heralded this and other protests like Occupy, the Women's March, and others as foiled and fruitless, unable to kind of trigger fundamental change. In the New Yorker article that Paola referred to, Mark Lila offered a distilled nugget, very annoying, of this dangerous sentiment when he declared, "The age of movement politics is over, at least for now. We need no more marchers. We need more mayors." I would charge back. Protest has never been a substitute for other forms of political organizing, but can always usually facilitate them. Protest generates the waves of momentum necessary to recruit new converts and emotionally ensure that the believers will remain believers. It creates new committed subjects willing to enter into the political process, as many women did after the Women's March. And obviously many other kind of political paths were taken. What this example shows is that many of the protests deemed initially as failures when measured with some distance or with other metrics are successful. The 2000 Women's March, for instance, likely helped to prime the digitally rooted Me Too movement, which led to likely the largest and most public and most satisfying felling of sexual abusers ever. In the process, renewing commitments to feminism and eventually intersectional feminism. Or Occupy, even with no demands, I think achieved something quite surprising. It cracked open a new type of left imaginary within mainstream American politics. So maybe one day radical demands could be made in a new way. And I think had Bernie won either the Democratic nomination or the presidency, we would be declaring Occupy as the biggest kind of success in the 21st century. And I think his surprise success was in part indebted to Occupy. So in raising these points, my aim is not to blindly celebrate these moments. What worries me is that if a message of futility around protest is pumped long enough into the public sphere, people will indeed start to believe the cynics. And again, I've seen this with my students. And only assess protests as worthy if, like the Parkland students from Florida, it yields such spectacularly impressive results in 9 days. Like everyone, I'm pretty stoked by their success and really thrilled at their reliance on tactical diversity as well. Of course, there's still a lot of work to do, but many protests won't and just cannot fit this mold. Social transformation is much slower and harder, filled with missteps, failed experiments, repression, and unexpected results. Along with the elusive nature of metrics for protests, many protests that don't impel immediate change are not signs of failure, but simply a sign that we need to compel more people to protest and continue to engage in the broader political struggle for change. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have the last two videos and then debate.
Be anonymous. Sometimes you gotta speak out publicly, but sometimes it works even better to speak out anonymously. Now this has its disadvantages, like working your whole life without getting any credit, but it has lots of advantages too. Our anonymity, for example, keeps the focus on the issues and away from our personalities. The mystery of who we might be draws lots of attention to the issues we promote. Plus, you won't believe what comes out of your mouth while wearing a gorilla mask.
The most inspiring and most powerful social movements of the last decades have all been called leaderless. But that's not really right. Certainly eliminating leadership is not enough. What the movements have really refused is that leadership be responsible for a strategy. That is, being able to make decisions over long-term plans, over the most important issues. What we really need is an inversion of strategy and tactics, so that leadership remains, but leadership be confined to tactics. Leadership be deployed and disposed as the needs arise, when special expertise is required, when rapid decision-making is required. But more important, the movements or the multitude should be responsible for strategy. There are certainly some examples that point in this direction. All of the great movements of 2011, from Cairo to Madrid to New York, like Black Lives Matter, all of them in some sense are trying to reinvent both the role of leadership and certainly the role of the movements. A more complete example might be the current municipal government in Barcelona trying to transform the power and the direction of the movements into an electoral experiment and even a governing experiment. But really this leaves us, it seems to me, with a question. The question is not so much how to limit leadership. That's the easy part. The hard part is how can the multitude become capable of deciding democratically over the most important long-term issues? How can the multitude become capable of strategy?
Pretty great. Yeah. So I would like to now call all of my great panelists here to the chairs. We're going to have Steve in the middle here, and then we're going to have, wait a second, I can't remember, Kaydrianne here. Steve, you're here.
Yes, thank you.
Biella, you're here. Jamal to the extreme over there, and I'm here. All right, thank you. And the first thing that I would like to do is to thank three people that really made this evening special. I mean, the first one is, of course, Erica. Erica, if you wouldn't mind stepping into the light for a moment. No, you've gone away. Well, you'll see her later. But then I would also like to thank Warrington Hudlin. Are you here, Sensei? Well, now, he's helped me a lot, as has Harry Wallach. Harry, where are you? Here, I saw you before. Oh, you're there, yeah. So thank you to Warrington and Harry for helping me with thinking this through. So it's been quite a wonderful series of presentations, and I want to ask you, did you ever meet before? Is this the first night you're in the same room together?
Yeah.
So, yeah, you have. Yeah, Steve and Jamal makes a lot of sense. Yeah, okay. But this is, it's quite interesting. I was touched, Kaydrianne, by what you were saying before, but two things mostly. But you were talking about the fact that we are very much within our zones of comfort, and that sometimes we don't get together enough. And I think it's also generational. I wonder if the leaders of the past protests and the leaders of the current protests, or leaders actually, leaderless maybe, come together and talk. You were speaking to those wonderful ladies that were leaders of the past. Today, without them in your Million Hoodies marches, etc., do you also seek the advice or the opinion of leaders from the past?
Absolutely. So I've seen it before, right? I feel like once you observe a pattern enough, it's easier to predict. It's easier to hack it. It's easier to innovate over the dysfunction that particular predicament or phenomenon causes for Black and brown communities, right? So it is a practice to absolutely consult and build with your elders and make sure that histories continue to be built upon, or not necessarily recreating the wheel, right? We're carrying forth traditions that have been born before and breathing new life into them, and just opening them up into more spaces. And yeah, so absolutely.
Yeah, because there's also the idea of continuity, of building change and real reform over time. You know, that's also another, we spoke about it before, you know, seeing long term what can happen. And I wanted to ask you, Jamal, there's a beautiful piece in an interview that somebody did to you. You're talking about walking on the campus of Columbia University and hearing the statue of the alma mater speaking to you and saying, oh, it's Professor Joseph now, right? Remember when you wanted to burn the place down? Right, so I wanted to ask you, what happens in hindsight? In Italian, we say with the wisdom of afterwards, but no wisdom here, just time. What happens? How do you look back? And with a sense of like we built it the right way, with a sense of we could have done things better?
When I look back, and then when you look at the, you know, Steve, those photos, and even the ones you showed, it's how young we were. Folks in the movement were, you know, were high school students and college students. The average age of someone in the Black Panther Party, I was 15, so everybody was like the older brothers and sisters, but the average age was like 19 or 20 years old. So that part in terms of young people, you know, we used to have one of our slogans was that youth makes the revolution, held true and was dynamic, and to trust that that's happening now. I get to travel a lot and inspired by that. The thing when I'm in the room with young activists and young leaders that we didn't know was surveillance and counterintelligence. The FBI's counterintelligence program, and just to what lengths and what inhumane criminal lengths the government went to destroy the movement, to divide the movement among themselves, to set people up, to murder people, as in the murder of Fred Hampton, and this happened across. And so I think the warning that we would like to share is that it is so important to have a face-to-face relationship. It is so important to, you know, if we're using Instagram and Twitter the way we used to use flyers and bullhorns to get people out, there was no substitute for those hours and hours that we spent working side by side, and then after sharing a meal, falling asleep on the couch or the floor, getting up, and knowing your brothers and sisters by their names and their backgrounds and their spirit. And it didn't matter if they were the same color, you called them brother, sister, or comrade. So that's the lesson to share, and is to be aware. And now, it is much easier to do the surveillance because all the tools are right there for people to look at your emails, to listen to your phone conversations. And I don't want to make folks paranoid, but just to turn on your own phone before we'd worry about people coming in to plant a bug, but to turn on your own phone to do it. But what's so important is, because even in the movement I see it, right? People get into what we call beefs, right? It's not just hip hop, where people like are mad because you didn't come to this protest or you're taking a position that I don't agree with. It's really so important to be in the room and to find out the things that we can agree on and the things that we love about each other, and to always remember that great movements are not built on hate, they're built on love. And they're built on, because that's what makes you want to sacrifice yourself and your time above all else.
Thank you. Steve, you've seen so many protests. I'm going to ask you something that only a curator of architecture and design could ask seriously. Okay. Is like, you've seen a lot of production design in these protests. So, and you were talking before about publicity. Tell me, from a production design standpoint, what were the most effective marches and gatherings in terms of having resonance, even formal resonance in the world?
The resonance comes more out of negativity.
Oh, that's what you were saying.
Yeah, and someone attacking it. In other words, it's a question of a group, like a movement, which is trying to get somewhere, and basically it's the baiting of the people. So much in the movement was that way. You know, you bring 110 people protesting against Sheriff Jim Clark, and you know that he's fidgety, and you know that he's not incredibly smart, and you know that he thinks the way to really accomplish something is to lock them all up. And the moment he does that, he's created something which is very positive in terms of civil rights. So there are elements in terms of civil rights strategy which worked on that level. There are elements where you took risks in terms of people, unfortunately, where the end product that you saw was that you would inspire a lot of people.
But it's
it's that, and it's the publicity, and it's what I talked about in terms of Charles Moore's photographs, where suddenly that happened. It seems to me that the two things which really make a movement work is someone with enormous charisma and also a strategy to, it's not that, it's not a strategy, but when bad things happen in Florida, suddenly everyone's inspired. Now people could talk about the gun situation. I'm not saying that the gun situation is going to be solved in any way. The New York Times had that great page which showed how many millions all these people were getting. And it's like columns that go down to here in terms of how much the NRA is paying people. And those people are going to act, a lot of them are going to act on those terms, because we don't have a situation where people, you know, they want their jobs. They want to keep their jobs in Congress, and they'll do things to do that. The other thing is, I can't understand. I haven't seen it anywhere, but, you know, all the Russia thing and Trump, why hasn't anyone said that Trump isn't going to do anything about Russia because he feels it's the only way he can stay in an election? He can win the election.
Well, you're saying that in some cases protest doesn't happen when it would be, what is this? You're saying that protest doesn't happen all the time when it's supposed to happen?
I'm saying that protest will always create a group of people who feel that they have great camaraderie, and that they're a group, and they have a very definite point of view.
I understand.
But you're working against such enormous, you know, enormous strategy against you.
But it's also the role of the testimony, because in the case of photography, it's so powerful, and so is, and so are other forms of communication. So, Biella, in the world of, let's not call it digital activism, how do you freeze the moment and transmit it the same way photographers have transmitted the Intifada or Tiananmen Square? How does that happen?
I mean, I think video is important today. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Video becomes particularly important to kind of transmit both the injustices as well as, you know, having small snippets of protests that can inspire others. And it's certainly the case that, again, the better that people can edit some of this material to kind of get it out there and make it viral, the better it can work, right? I just think the big challenge is precisely the fact that we are scrolling through our feeds with so much coming at us, right? And sometimes it's very overwhelming. You're like, okay, what issue am I going to focus on? And sometimes it does seem like today, you know, since about 2011 with the Arab Spring and then everything that kind of flowed from there to Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and the Parkland process, there are these moments where the sheer abundance of videos, comments, images, smart commentary kind of come together, coalesce, and there is that kind of momentum. And there's no doubt that the online world kind of helped shape that, right? And so it's particularly important. And again, the far right has been very, very savvy themselves about deploying all these tools in order to recruit people. And so we might be horrified by it, but there's also many lessons to be learned.
It's interesting. Yeah, it really is interesting to see what works, and we can learn from them, you're right. Erica, I know that we have some of the
Yes, we have an amazing panel, but we also have an outstanding audience. And so I wanted to give the opportunity to Glenn Cantav to give a few words on an organization very interesting that has found a way to use VR to promote activism.
Yeah, you can, yeah.
Okay.
See it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Glenn Cantav, and on January 20th, 2017, I was 23 years old, and against the best wishes of my mother, I went down to Washington, D.C. to protest the inauguration of Donald Trump. I put myself in shackles, and I put on a sign that said property of Trump and his friends in the 1%, and I brought a virtual reality camera to capture it all. The next day, I did the same thing for the Women's March, and then I called two friends from college, and we decided to start a virtual reality documentary on activism in the age of Trump called We the People. From there, we went to the People's Climate March in DC and a White Lives Matter March in Tennessee, and we covered the riots in Charlottesville, and we have footage in virtual reality where you see the cascades of billowing smoke all around you, and Hawk Newsome and I were dodging rocks thrown by Nazis, and you can see the people beating each other with sticks, and it's a very intense environment. And I decided that I wanted to also engage in a direct form of activism, and I thought about the fact that I hate looking up in my public spaces and seeing monuments of slave owners like Christopher Columbus, someone who catalyzed the genocide of 80 to 100 million indigenous people and started the transatlantic slave trade, something that took away the identity of millions of African Americans. It's the reason why I don't know my cultural identity and the reason why I don't know my real last name. And we are working on an augmented reality book on the history of Christopher Columbus. The way it works, you see an animation. We developed a smartphone app. You put the app over the image, and an augmented reality animation plays while a soundtrack with poetry based on academically verifiable evidence plays. So think Hamilton meets intense spoken word poetry. So we're essentially distilling the works of people like Howard Zinn and Michelle Alexander into something that's easily digestible. And I'm sorry, in this age of digital, we're saying digital activism here. But the idea is, you know, the attention spans are short, but we're distilling it very, very short so you can get through it in 10 minutes. So the principle is we want to get this work into every high school in New York City, eventually nationwide, and create augmented reality installations that can go into public spaces so that the public can engage. And we see this as a potential for the catalyst for a social revolution in terms of how we think of our monuments, in terms of how we think of our public spaces, in terms of how we can change our textbooks. And the final thing is we're developing education programs where we can teach Black and brown youth about virtual reality and augmented reality so that we can take ownership of our narratives. This movement in the age of Trump is not about taking it back to 2008 or taking it back to a little bit before that. It's about holding ourselves to a higher standard and our democracy to a higher standard.
I have to stop you.
Oh, that's the last thing I had to say.
Yeah,
so
no, it's all great. I just wanted, because I feel so guilty.
No,
because
of course.
I don't have. Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Erica, did you have somebody else, or shall we give the?
Well, we have also the president of Black Lives Matter New York, so maybe very briefly, if you want to.
Yeah, you've already spoken in the video.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamal Joseph. Wow, I'm just like I've never had a chance to witness you speak, and I'm just so inspired by what you all started, and I just pay you the ultimate in homage. God bless you, brother.
Thank you, brother.
I'll be quick, but I want to pose a question to you all. Right now, people are talking about women's rights. I've marched. DACA, I've marched. Immigrants' rights, I've marched. But we've forgotten America's original sin. Mm-hmm. We're talking about slavery. We're talking about the 3/5 compromise. How dare you move on when we are still dying in the streets? How dare you forget the people who this great empire, our back, it was built on? Like, how can you move on? How can you say you love your neighbor when you don't love the people who stand next to you every single day? How can you not show up for us? We are the reason you have your way of life. And we are dying. We're being murdered in the streets. We're being undereducated and overly incarcerated. How can you sit by and let that happen?
Well, we have some time to open up for questions from the audience. Anybody has questions that you want to ask? Or if you have questions for each other. Oh, there is a question over there in the middle, over there. Is that LaToya? Hey, hi.
Hey, love the panel. Everyone's contributions were amazing. All the additional folks, your contributions were amazing too. I had a quick question on the co-option of protest. It's been touched on a few times. The first gentleman who spoke, I mean, you spoke really eloquently about people infiltrating movements in those conversations and looking at how people are parroting language. What do you think should be known when people are setting up a protest, when people are looking to protest, to prevent that type of co-option or to prevent that type of infiltration? What are the tactics that people should share that you guys know?
Can I jump in?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer, but what you had mentioned, what you pose is the more successful you are, the more likely that people will try to infiltrate and disable the movement. And it used to be the case that it was mostly the government that could do it, right? But today, security firms are being hired by corporations to do this sort of work. And very scarily, there's kind of grassroots infiltration movements coming out of the image boards as well, right? So I think that's something to really keep in mind. And I think one of the tough balances in movements is that on the one hand, you are going to have difference and disagreement, and that's okay. But infiltrators will try to exploit that to, tear the fabric of the movement apart. And so I think that's something to think about. And just very briefly, when I read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, this is a slightly different point, but she really, makes the point that many of the successful movements in the 60s, 70s, and 80s then required governments to roll out the shock doctrine. So the more successful you are, the better prepared you have to be for actual pushback.
Kaydrianne, do you have something?
Yeah, I have to say in my experience, I've always just been able to tell. On September 5th, there was a large civil disobedience in DC, and I was marching up to, be arrested, arm in arm with this man. I have one person here, we're in a line in the front, and he starts asking such specific questions. It's like, did y'all know each other before? It's like, where all are the chapters in Million Hoodies? How all, just like really specific, incessant questions while we're at the action. And then lo and behold, we all get booked out, and he never comes out of the police station, right? So just, and like upon checking back with other folks, they had the same experience. Infinite questions, very nuanced, very detailed. And that has been a consistent trigger that folks have noticed.
You had a very painful experience, Jamal.
Yeah, when I joined the Panthers as a 15-year-old who didn't know his dad and whose grandfather had passed, it was as much about the search for manhood as the movement, right? And two great mentors. One was Afeni Shakur, who I talked about. The other was a guy named Yewa, who was a section leader, a lieutenant, and made sure I was at the breakfast program on time and that I memorized the 10-point program. And when I learned enough to get weapons training, trained me, and even came to my grandmother's house to convince her when she found, I was on the go all the time. She was like, clean your room. And, I was like, I'll get to it, Grandma. So like most frustrated parents, she went to clean my room. And hidden underneath my bed was all my Black Panther newspapers. And if you've ever seen Emory Douglas's art with the cops looking like pigs and, school children carrying AK-47s and textbooks, and I came home and it was piled up, and she was like, you're part of this, you can't go back. And he came to my grandmother's house and convinced her to let me go back. About 4 weeks later, we were arrested, pre-dawn raids, a case that became known as the Panther 21. And when we were trying to find out what this conspiracy case was all about, there were two members of not informers, they were cops, part of an elite unit that they had in New York called the Boss Unit, the Bureau of Special Services. One guy was Gene Roberts, who had been Malcolm X's bodyguard. There are pictures online of Gene Roberts giving Malcolm mouth-to-mouth resuscitation after he was shot. He was his trusted bodyguard. And he became a lieutenant of security in the Panther Party because he had been right there with Malcolm X. And the other was my mentor, the person who taught me how to walk like a Panther, talk like a Panther, came to my grandmother, was an undercover cop. But Afeni always sensed him the way you did, because we'd be talking about protests, tenants would come in and we'd be talking about organizing a rent strike, helping the tenants fix up their building, being out there to make sure that the marshals didn't evict the tenants. And he'd be saying, yeah, but where does the landlord live? Let's drag him up to Harlem, have a people's tribunal, stuff a dead rat in his mouth, and lynch him from 125th Street. And of course, the Young Panthers were like, yeah, let's do that. And the wiser heads would go like, but what would that do to the people in that building? You really would be giving them an excuse to come in not only with marshals, but with tanks and with guns. So usually they're there not just to get information, but to agitate. And so that's why it's good to understand people's practice, their work, where they really come from, and really, as you said, to examine their spirit.
Questions? Yeah, there's, yep.
So one of the things that I've been noticing about online and social media space at this moment is that the very sort of freedom and openness to say anything has been increasingly co-opted by both state actors and also just fascists. There's a profusion of false imagery, false information, whose goal is to make the very nature of reality unstable. There's also a sort of trolling that is similar in form to the sort of old school, misogynist, racist harassment, but it's being paid for by states now. And its goal is to make online space too distracting and toxic to use. As artists and as activists, how can we fight against this and reclaim online?
Well, Biela, not an easy one.
So, first of all, I mean, this may sound a little bit weird, but some of the most intensive propaganda interventions in World War I were not revealed for many, many years after they had stopped. So I am happy that at least we're explicitly talking about the propaganda as it's happening, because it's, I think, slightly less effective insofar as at least groups of people are slightly aware of that reality, whereas in some previous propaganda programs, it was really kind of unknown until some of this information was declassified. I know that's not, totally satisfying, but that is a good first step. And then I think another answer, and this is something drawn a little bit from Stephen Duncombe, who has a great book called Dream, who sort of argues that progressive movements need counter-propaganda. It's got to be ethical, but you also have to create new realities for people so that you can draw those eyeballs away from that other noise. And that, I believe, is incredibly, incredibly important. And it's something that many movements have done in the past, right? With their imagery, with their message. But precisely if you don't take kind of the means of control for an ethical propaganda, you will lose because others are doing so quite sophisticatedly through nation states as well as grassroots movements on the ground.
Steve?
What do you do with a country which is split maybe 60-40 or something like that, where both sides are highly emotional and both sides have had a background in terms of the people around them and in terms of the way they've grown up and in terms of how they watch television, where they are really not subject to change that easily, if at all. And what do you do? How do you unite a country? How do you unite a country at this point? I don't know the answer, and I don't know who does. I think it happens with charisma, and I think, Donald Trump has a lot of what we would call negative charisma, but it's a forceful charisma. And we also, again, have a Congress which is more interested in the buck and keeping their jobs than really dealing with what is best for America or what is best for human rights and basic, basic freedoms and attitudes.
Well, this is a pretty good way to kind of end the evening, end this part of the evening, because as you know very well, there's, as I always say, mediocre wine and so-so snacks outside, and we can go on forever. But yeah, please,
I do have one thought. And,
sorry.
And it might be considered as part of a closing thought, and it's based on what you're saying. One of my favorite movies is Steven Soderbergh's Che. It's a great film, part 1 and part 2. And I rewatched it recently, and one of my favorite scenes has become when Che and Fidel and the rebels had to abandon a camp, a base, and Batista's forces came in, and they were looking at the base that they had taken, and the thing that disturbed them the most about what had happened was not that they had found weapons and that the rebels had a base. And he said, but O Comandante, look, this was a clinic. This was a school. This is what they're doing. Now, J. Edgar Hoover went before Congress in 1968, and he said that the Black Panther Party was the greatest threat to the internal security of America. And what Hoover hated the most was not the Panthers' stance against the police, point number 7, we want an immediate end to police brutality and the murder of black people, was the free breakfast program for children.
Mm-hmm.
He saw that as seditious and treasonous, because what Hoover understood was that the Panthers understood, and other grassroots organization was about, when you talk about protests and movement, it's not so much what you arrive to do when you're there, it's what you leave behind. And then when you understand that when you're talking about ideas like freedom, liberation, and justice, that for the folks in the community that need to be organized or need to understand what you are, that these things are abstract if they're struggling to survive. So freedom to someone who is hungry is a meal. Liberation to someone who is shivering, homeless in the cold, is a warm, dry place to sleep, safe place to sleep. Justice to someone who can't get medical care is medicine when you need it and health care when you need it. And so 50 years later, we see people saying, I ate, not only did I eat in the free breakfast program, but the free breakfast programs connected to, to schools and to all of that started with teenagers in the community saying, let's organize a breakfast program for kids because we recognize that need. We recognize that you're saying black students are disrupted. Maybe it's really hard for a kid in first grade or kindergarten to listen to a teacher say that 3 apples plus 2 apples equal 5 apples and their stomachs are growling. So it's that organizing folks around their needs, and it's what we leave behind. So people would do the freedom rides, and they would do the protests, those marches in the South. But Steve, what was left behind? It was those freedom schools, right?
No,
there
that's
was
absolutely
economic
right.
forum.
The 74 summer of 74,
right.
64 was really based not only on voting rights but on teaching.
On teaching.
Yeah.
So there was those models of the freedom schools.
There's a picture in my book of this old woman.
Exactly. There were the food cooperatives
all around them.
They were there. So my son, I'll end on this point. My oldest son has sickle cell anemia, and is also a graduate of Columbia University. He helped. He's an activist, and he helped organize a forum at Mount Sinai Hospital, and there were health caregivers, sicklers, their families, and a doctor who I never met before. We were sitting way in the back. An older doctor who was a hematologist, a white doctor, started his comment at this conference saying, "We're not for the street corner clinics of the Black Panther Party, that healthcare system, sickle cell testing and awareness would not be where it is today." So when we think about protests, when we think about where we go and what we do, and when we think about all of the tools available to us, we must leave by thinking what we came there to do. Remember we talked about strategy and your question of what was the movement about? And we must also think about, brothers and sisters, what is it concretely that we're going to leave behind?
Can I say one more thing?
I don't know, Steve. All right, say.
The only thing I want to say is that the women's movement, which is so strong at this point, has to be about voting. I mean, which it is, but that has to be the main thing, because the only way things can change at this point is with voting. In the same way that the civil rights movement changed the South in terms of voting.
We'll remember that. Well, it seems very clear. It seems very clear here. Is there still a point to protesting? Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God. Yes, absolutely. So that's something we can go home very, very clear in mind, keeping it in mind. But also, we have had a lot of clarity about the fact that we don't need to wait to look for immediate gratification, that there might be a wait in front of us, but that it's always worthwhile. And we've talked about so many heroes, we've seen so many heroes, and it's always inspiring. Every single story is inspiring. Personally, I am also very inspired by the story of somebody like Jan Talash that decided to protest against the fear of compromise and complacency. So that was also quite interesting. I think that what's most important is to keep going no matter what. Steve, I have to stop you because otherwise...
Let me say one thing.
Okay, one.
Which is simply that most of our major heroes have been shot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well,
that's it.
Yeah, on this note, thank you, wonderful panelists. And let's go outside. Let's go outside. outside and have some wine together.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, Steve. There you go. You're just wonderful.